Will nuclear war be next if Russia successfully takes Ukraine? The answer is no.
But they see this as a fight for their existential survival, and they are right. So there will be a nuclear exchange. Just to underline that, if Ukraine loses, we will lose cities.
First, I want to make it clear that I do not agree with Putin's actions, just as I did not agree with the U.S. actions of invading Iraq. And at the end of this, if you bother to watch till the end, you will see why both Putin and Peter are wrong. Now, this video will not be what you're used to. It will not be concise or flashy. It will be long, dry, maybe even boring, but it will be the truth. So before I dive in, let me make a few statements concerning Peter Zeihan. He is a very intelligent man, a wealth of knowledge on everything demographic and geospatial. His knowledge is invaluable for intelligence analysts and planners. In fact, I agree with much of what he is saying on various subjects. But he is no intelligence analyst or planner, which you need to have an understanding of if you want to be called a geopolitical expert. There are whole careers built just behind those positions. They take the information in that someone like a Peter would gather and apply their tools, methods, and tradecraft to provide potential outcomes. Peter is not doing this. He is leapfrogging over all of that to get to the narrative, voicing a potential outcome such as nuclear war if Ukraine loses as a certainty. This is merely one of many different outcomes of which he has the least likely chances of occurring. And that's what I want to dive into on this video. But first, let me show you that I am not alone in this assessment. There are voices in the intel community saying what I'm saying. For example, in this article, Putin's hollow nuclear threat. Vladimir Putin understands the effects of employing the most destructive weapons in his arsenal. Officials and analysts say he is many things, but he is not suicidal. I'm not going to read the article, but I will scroll down to a paragraph quoting a senior analyst. The likelihood of Russia choosing or Putin choosing to use nuclear weapons directly against the West is astronomically low. It should not even be seriously considered at this stage, says Catherine Lauer, senior intelligence analyst at the Independent Institute for the Study of War. Now, this article was written in February 24 of this year, but I have been voicing this on my TikToks for over a year, while people like Peter have been voicing the opposite. In this video, we will touch many topics that each deserve their own video, but are necessary to bring up in order to draw the logical line that often gets obscured by opportunists. I will be mentioning the tools and techniques used by intelligence analysts and planners to develop military orders and even national defense strategy. Everything I'm going to outline is done at every level of government, from the national level across multiple agencies all the way down to the battalions of our military. They are all variations of the same tools, processes, and techniques to present possible outcomes, and it's within these tools that people like Peter only do the first half of the work and skip the most important part to drive their narratives, leading people into hysteria. Now, what I'm not going to do is attempt to cite every chapter and verse of every aspect of every tool or process that gets mentioned. I'm trying to make this understandable to the layman, as it's the average person that news pundits and people like Peter speak to. I could make an individual video on everything I bring up, so if that is of interest, or if there are a series of questions that spring up, let me know in the comments, and I will attempt to get them answered for you so you can achieve some understanding. In this video, I will be discussing the Intelligence Preparation of the Battlefield, or IPB, which is a 4-step process led by the S2, or intelligence officer within a military staff, comprised of admin, operations, logistics, communications, legal, medical, pilots, interagency partner reps such as CIA or DEA, etc. The IPB process is a critical component of the military decision-making process, or MDMP for the Army, or the Marine Corps Planning Process, or MCPP for the Marine Corps. Each branch has their own planning process outlined in doctrine and publications. They feed into the Joint Intelligence Preparation of the Operational Environment, or JIPO. It is within JIPO that you will get into complex IPB that begins to take into account the holistic operational environment with great emphasis on the demographics, their interactions with each other, their government, civil, and religious structures, and their history. And it's this history that Peter and pundits gloss over or ignore outright in their deterministic prediction of a nuclear war. And I say prediction and not assessment because if it were an assessment, they would first preface it with the fact that this is one of many potential outcomes, and then qualify it with their ratings of most likely, likely, or least likely, and most dangerous. Now, many that have been involved in military operations are familiar with the most likely courses of action, MLCOA, or most dangerous courses of action, or MDCOA, referring to only two possible outcomes. But within the military decision-making process, there are multiple enemy COAs produced, and each one discussed by the planning team for a logical determination of severity and potential outcome. For training purposes and brevity, we tend to only operate around the most likely and most dangerous. In Peter's prediction of if Ukraine loses, we will lose cities, nuclear weapons implied, is spoken on with certainty instead of qualifiers such as least likely, most dangerous outcome, as an intelligence analyst would use, and he didn't use them because he is not an intelligence analyst. Now, an intelligence analyst will use the same data Peter does and draw a more refined, more accurate, and maybe even counter-assessment because they use all the tools within the planning process, of which there are many, and being that I'm a certified instructor in intelligence and tactics, I could explain and have used all of these listed here. Center of gravity critical vulnerability analysis, the systematic breakdown of an enemy or weapon system's strengths and vulnerabilities. My instructor first used Godzilla to make it fun. The OODA loop, observe, orient, decide, act. Coined by Air Force General Boyd, the process describes getting inside your enemy's OODA loop to be him, which was wonderfully presented in the movie We Were Soldiers. Within IPB, you have the application and analysis of the following, of which are only some examples and not a comprehensive list. A scope, areas, structures, capabilities, organizations, people, and events are civil considerations. MET-TC, mission, enemy, terrain, and weather, troops and support available, time available, and civil considerations. These are mission variables. This is often matrixed with PMICI-PT, political, military, economic, social, information, infrastructure, physical environment, and time. He should also be using an analytical framework that relies upon the instruments of national power, called DIMEFIL, stands for Diplomatic, Information, Military, Economic, Financial, Intelligence, and Law Enforcement, which assesses security cooperation amongst our allies. Russia and China do this, and in their findings they know not to directly engage NATO, or they will not reach or even come close to their objectives, and in this case Russia will not engage a NATO country. However, and this is my first assessment, they will attempt to secure any non-NATO country in this sphere of influence, which is why they moved on Ukraine and are attempting to destabilize Moldova, of which I made that prediction many years ago and as my job as an intelligence officer, and more recently as much as a year ago on my backup TikTok channel, where many Moldovans and their supporters were angry with me that I said they were screwed due to their situation. But I digress. Now getting back to IPB. Enemy, threats, capabilities, and goals, all found in steps 2 and 3 and compiled for decision making in step 4. What's also included is enemy doctrine, or military doctrine, and in this case, Russian military doctrine. And despite all the bloviating and strategic messaging from Russian TV propagandists and statesmen, the Russian military will still adhere to their military doctrine, and in this case, of the use of nuclear weapons. And Putin has stated this.
Целостности нашей страны. Для защиты России и нашего народа мы, безусловно, используем все имеющиеся в нашем распоряжении средства.
They are only used as a last line of defense to protect Russia from an invading force, not in offensive maneuvers to seize key terrain and operational objectives, as Peter implies. Within the analysis of the operating environment and complex IPB, you find friendly and enemy course of action development, analysis, comparison, and approval, where you outline the many different COAs you think the enemy will take based off the information you have processed. These activities also take into account through the IPB process the capabilities of the enemy in all the warfighting domains, which are air, land, sea, space, cyber, and the information environment, which is where you saw plenty use of in this war. Some examples are the Ghost of Kyiv or the events of Snake Island. It is within these domains that lie the capabilities of defense that Peter either does not take into account or ignores completely, primarily the technology within these spaces, such as advanced air defense systems, long-range artillery, cyber, and everyone's favorite, nuclear. This, coupled with Russian military doctrine, is why nuclear weapons will not be used by the Russians to further their objectives, which Peter assumes based off of his narrative of history and rhetoric from Putin, which Putin uses to galvanize his citizens and conduct strategic messaging in the information age, but is not a function of Russian policy.
Territories that are completely empty and by Russian definition totally useless, but totally flat. And you can totally get a Mongol horde through that. Russia's been invaded 50-odd times in its history. And never once, when the foe has made it to the green, made it to the good land, have the Russians ever ejected them. It's been the weather that's done the heavy lifting. So the Russian strategy since the beginning has always been the same. Expand out of the green through the beige, and you get to those red markers, those geographic barriers that you can't shove a panzer division through. And then you forward position your very, very slow-moving rail-supplied troops in those blue access points that are between those barriers. The Soviet system was the height of Russian security. They controlled all of those access points, and then they lost them all. Post-Soviet Russia, especially under Putin, has spent every waking moment trying to rebuild that outer shell. And in the 23 years that Putin has been in charge, he has launched now 8 military conflicts with that in mind.
In case it wasn't clear, Peter's image here is inverted because he pulled it from his book. So Peter assumes that because Russia was invaded throughout its history due to poor defensive geography, pretty much endless miles of flat land with almost no defensive terrain features, that this is the reason why Russia invaded Ukraine, to gain the 2 most important of those geographic access points. First, that is an assumption that must be noted but not used as a deciding factor, especially not a sole deciding factor. Assumptions must also meet the following criteria in planning. Is it logical? Is it realistic? Is it essential for planning to continue? Does it assume away an enemy-adversary capability or limitation? Second, those past invasions were driven by ethnic differences, resources, and land, specifically land armies, before the technological or nuclear age, which now mitigates and deters historical aggression, such as superior air defenses, long-range artillery, smart mines, and tactical nukes. This is not a dismissal of history or a siding with the modern technological era. It is a melding of both. The latter mitigates and deters the former, and there are plenty of recent examples to support this, that I will touch on later on. So then why did Russia invade Ukraine? There's more than one reason, and you can find it in history as Peter did, but he failed to apply the technological capabilities that mitigate the need for those historical objectives, such as the 2 points Russia needs to capture beyond Ukraine. Now, one of the techniques used for analysis is what we call turning the map around. And what this means is that we attempt to gain the perspective of the world or the situation from that of the adversary. And in this case, we need to understand why Putin wanted to invade. Quick orientation, this is Moscow, then you have Latvia, Lithuania, Belarus, Ukraine. Here is their border, and it's worth saying apparently that NATO already borders Russia, and the distance between the border of Latvia and Moscow is a mere 8-hour drive. From Putin's perspective, he wants a buffer between NATO and Russia, more specifically Moscow. This does not mean he will go through NATO to make that happen. It does mean that any non-NATO country like Moldova is up for grabs. Prior to 2014, it was acceptable to have an independent pro-Russian Ukraine as a buffer to NATO. Putin wants that back and influence over any other non-NATO country. That would be mission accomplished for Putin. Putin cites previous agreements made by the US that NATO would not expand eastward, and those agreements were clearly violated. And to that I say irrelevant, for 2 reasons. 1, those countries that join NATO are sovereign, and their people can make up their own damn minds. It does not matter what may or may not have been agreed upon when they weren't even in the room to make the agreement. And 2, historically, geographic vulnerabilities are sufficiently mitigated in the technological and nuclear age. While a NATO Ukraine would create a straight line between the border of Ukraine and the capital of Russia, any overt military action against Russian sovereignty would be met with a multi-layered conventional defense and nuclear force if needed. Now, one might argue that Putin didn't want to create that opportunity for the West, for fear that the only option is total annihilation. But I'd push back and say that it's an effective deterrent that's already been tested. If it weren't for nukes, North Korea would likely already be gone. If it weren't for the desire of nukes, we wouldn't be putting so much effort into trying to stop Iran from acquiring them. Arguably, if Gaddafi had kept his nukes, his people probably wouldn't have killed him. Arguably, had Ukraine kept their nukes, then this invasion might not have occurred. I know some people argue that the ability to launch those nukes was kept by Russia, but that could have been changed had history played out differently. Either way, nukes keep the West at bay, and hell, might have even kept Putin at bay. So what's another reason? Probably the only one that has some semblance of reality: access to a warm water port into the Black Sea. Putin does not like that Russia is declining power with only local geographical influence, and the idea that their Black Sea fleet be threatened by Western influence is more of a national embarrassment than a threat to their national security. Additionally, it is very costly for Russia to maintain cold water access to the world's oceans, and so from their perspective, access to the Black Sea is a must. So what are the other reasons floated by Putin? Was it denazification? No. The Azov Regiment and their supporters don't even number in the tens of thousands, yet alone hundreds of thousands. The regiment itself is only 2,500 people strong and was created in response to Russian aggression in 2014. That said, they are a far-right extremist group of anti-Semites and white ethnic nationalists, which is extensively covered at Stanford. Was it bioweapons? No. Soviet-era bioweapons labs were converted into biolabs. And the reason for their existence beyond the Soviet era is because this part of the continent suffers from a plethora of zoonotic diseases and outbreaks over the last 70 years, such as anthrax, plague, measles, tularemia, and cholera. It boils down to ethnic pride and nostalgia for a bygone era. Crimea and the Donbass region have long been a point of contention for the Ukrainian people and Putin and the Russians. I say Putin because he has led the charge to maintain influence over all of Ukraine since before 2003. Over the last 20 years, he's gambled on this idea and lost much. Instead of being upfront on his intentions of territorial control of traditionally ethnic Russian lands such as the Donbass and Crimea, he instead attempted to placate the Ukrainian government and its people because he thought he'd be able to maintain influence and control over the entire country through their government. But the Ukrainian people rejected this in early 2014 and ousted the pro-Russian government and replaced it with a pro-Western government. Now you can blame the CIA for this all you want, but I'd point you to the extremely long historical strife between these two ethnic groups before blaming it all on the CIA, of which their efforts can't even be measured against organic efforts of the local Ukrainian populace. And so Putin subsequently annexed Crimea that same year with the help of his little green men, and the battle over the Donbass and Crimea was waged. And so it should have been no surprise that Russia's amassing of forces would lead to an all-out invasion of Ukraine in February of 2022. Now, does America, and by extension our money and influence, need to be there? Probably not. Not a favorite answer of pro-Western analysts, but it's the truth. The lead in this operation should have always been taken by European countries at the very least, but then they would require them to spend more money, which they would happily not do. Except for Poland. They seem to want to take the lead. Besides, America's military-industrial complex probably wouldn't have allowed it. The opportunity to expend product and extend influence while not shedding American blood is just too good to pass up. So back in 2014, we began training Ukrainian forces through NATO Advise and Assist missions and Special Forces operations such as CIA Ground Branch in anticipation of defending Ukraine. And the corporate globalist media gaslit the Western world with the fear that Putin was going to steamroll Ukraine and take back the former Soviet states and reconstitute the USSR, which even the most novice analysts knew that wasn't true so long as they used the tools and techniques I outlined earlier. Many in the military and intelligence community knew that Putin couldn't touch a single NATO allied country, yet that didn't stop the media and Western governments from telling everyone that Big Bad Bear was coming for the rest of them. The best Putin could have hoped for was to invade non-NATO countries like Moldova, which was always a part of his plan, as I noted it over a year ago on my TikToks, and now pro-Russian forces are attempting to make inroads towards that goal. And if I knew all of this before the invasion, you know damn well Washington and our NATO allies knew it too, which means the reason for us being involved is really just because we can. Ukraine's neighbors should have come to their aid, not America and her piggy bank. Unfortunately, one could argue that we had to, because Europe had gone soft and gotten comfortable with the American security umbrella. Conversely, Russia has no valid reason to invade, so now they just might reap what they sow, a pariah nation holding on to the ghost of what it once was, willing to plunge the region to despair. Instead of taking advantage of their position as a nuclear power with access to vast resources for the whole world to buy. How will it end? No one knows for sure, but a nuclear exchange is currently the least likely outcome. Putin hopes that the Western populace tires of this and eventually pulls support, allowing him to take Ukraine, shore up defenses along the border, and then take Moldova. And NATO hopes to drag this out until Russia has exhausted all of its human capital and resources, forcing it into capitulation. I don't think either side will get what they want fully. My assessment from a year ago remains the same. Russia will hold on to the Donbass and Crimea territories, and Ukraine and its government will still be pro-Western and Ukrainian. What I can tell you for certain, though, is that we are not in World War III, and we are nowhere near nuclear war. There is not a future where Russia breaks apart, and there is not a future where Russia invades NATO. Both sides will have to come to an agreement where neither side gets what they want. Maybe that is a potential realignment of borders. Maybe the annexed regions get recognized and the Dnieper River acts as the demarcation line. After all, the original border of Ukraine was drawn up to include pro-Russian lands for the very reason to maintain pro-Russian governmental control of the whole of Ukraine, and that has since failed and should be accepted by both sides. I don't claim my assessment to be the most likely outcome, but I do claim it to be more likely than Peter's, and mine is at least echoed by noted Professor Steve Walt of the Harvard Kennedy School of Public Policy and Government, of which I am an alum. After this clip, I will have some closing thoughts.
The war in Ukraine, in some respects, has dispelled a whole series of liberal illusions that misled many people during the post-Cold War period. The idea that major war was almost sort of burned out of Europe, that it was never going to happen there, that some combination of the European Union, NATO enlargement, the spread of markets, economic interdependence was going to make this a vast zone of peace. And I think what the European countries have now discovered is that, that it would have been nice if it had turned out that way, but it didn't. And that hard power still matters in world politics, that one can't simply let defense capabilities atrophy for several decades and expect you'll never need them. That if you become highly dependent economically on one country, that can be a problem if the relationship with that country deteriorates. The second wake-up call here is that we're being reminded that powerful countries often do pretty horrible things when they feel, rightly or wrongly, that their security is being endangered. The United Nations and other institutions cannot prevent a great power from doing something stupid, often cruel, when they feel their circumstances require it. And we ought to have known that. This is not the first time in the post-Cold War period that a major power has invaded a sovereign country on the basis of a series of illusions. The United States invaded Iraq in 2003 on the basis of a series of illusions. We did it without approval of the UN Security Council. It was every bit as illegal as what Russia is now doing. And it's worth remembering, of course, that didn't turn out particularly well for us either. Vladimir Putin, in the fullness of time, may learn some of the same lessons we learned. Now, having said that, the response to what's going on in Europe is, in some respects, gratifying, and the response of the Western Europeans, our NATO allies, I think has surprised many people. They were able to sustain a fairly complacent attitude for a long time because they were confident that at the end of the day, the United States would always bail them out and come in and protect them. And the speed with which Europe has adjusted its thinking there is really quite striking. And I believe Europeans also understand that over time, the United States is going to want to focus a lot more attention on Asia, that when this crisis is over, China will still be there. And moreover, One of the implications of this crisis may be to essentially put China and Russia closer together, to draw a sharper distinction between autocratic regimes and the world's democracies, and that therefore that's going to require the United States to do more in Asia. There's been, in the first week or so, a certain degree of premature triumphalism when we saw that the Russian army was having more difficulties than Vladimir Putin probably expected. There was this immediate tendency to say, well, Putin has already lost, etc. I think that's quite premature. And moreover, the assumption that defeat of Russia is going to require regime change there is both A, premature, and B, quite possibly dangerous. And there have been people who should know better in the West saying things like that. You do not want to back a nuclear power into a corner where they feel their survival is at stake. And that means the diplomatic challenge that we're facing going forward is a very, very tricky one. This war will not end until the various parties involved come to understand that they're not going to be able to achieve their objectives, and they start looking for a bargain where they each get at least some of what they think they want, while recognizing they can't get all of what they want. And I don't think we're there yet. So I am hoping that people inside the various governments are starting to think creatively about how this gets resolved, because the longer it goes on, the more damage gets done, and the more there is a risk that this begins to spread and spin out of control. War has its own logic, has its own dynamic to it, and countries that get in them often find themselves in a month, in 6 months, in a year, in circumstances that are very different than what they expected, and something they would never have gone into voluntarily had they known where it was going to lead.
All right, so I want to close out with a few thoughts. This idea that the Russians need to feel secure by closing historical land gaps that give access to the open plains of that part of the continent is not a fact. It is an assumption that is only supported by battles largely fought prior to the advent of the airplane, yet alone air power, or the advancement of air defenses, nuclear weapons, cyber capabilities, industrial modernization, and global supply chains. It's because of all these things that the Russians, if they are so scared, only need to create a buffer at most to the Ukrainian NATO borders and at least the Dnieper River. And I would argue that had they done nothing at all, that they would have still been in a secure space, but that ship has sailed. But I really need to hammer home the illogical conclusion that if Ukraine loses, nuclear weapons will be employed. I mean, imagine that conversation. They secure the border between NATO and Ukraine, but they're not done yet. And they know that the only way to get to their supposed objective, which is this gap, that they need to launch nukes. But they also know that if they launch nukes, that'll basically plunge the world into nuclear war, thus destroying the whole purpose of securing these gaps. Like, it's completely illogical, and the fact that it's being floated is ridiculous. Unfortunately, that's what Peter is predicting, and that's what pundits are running with. Now, I know there are some people out there that actually think that may happen, and it's truly sad that they've been so brainwashed into thinking that that's a possibility. Putin and the Russian people are not unstoppable machines hell-bent on world domination, or else. They are people too, and they recognize the limitations in front of them. They know that the way the chessboard is arrayed, that the best that they can hope for is to achieve a pro-Russian Ukraine and Moldova, with the expectation that a large part of the world will still need their resources and will still do business with them, and that the worst that can happen is a NATO-aligned Ukraine at the borders of Russia, with a reorganization of the global order and supply chains and a tenuous peace, because a nuclear-armed country is a secure country. Alright, I hope you got a lot out of this, because it was a lot to put together. If you enjoyed this content or have suggestions, please comment. And as always, like, subscribe, and share.